What is the most bone-chilling, inconceivable thing your parents have done to you? My husband and I got married in 2002 and had our son, Brian, 10 months later. In May 2004, we welcomed our twin girls, Mary and Lisa. My family was beautiful. Every time I took a picture of us, we looked like the families in the stock photos you can Google. However, I can no longer look at the pictures of us because it makes my stomach churl. When my twin girls were born, we had no issues in the hospital. They were born right on their due date and passed all their postnatal tests with stellar stats. But when we got home we noticed that Mary was developing a rash. I hadn't really dealt with allergies in kids since my son didn't have them and neither did any child or adult in my entire family. I wasn't sure what it was. I thought that maybe she just had sensitive skin like me. It took 3 months to figure it out. During that time, her allergic reactions got more and more severe. Eventually, we figured out Mary was allergic to coconut. The doctors told us that it was a particularly rare allergen, so it wasn't on any of the skin test panels they ran. When we found out what she was allergic to, we were relieved. So relieved. You see, when I was a kid, my mother would put coconut oil in my hair all the time. It looked greasy as hell. I hated it, and once I was old enough to start doing my own hair, I never put that stuff in my hair again. Imagine the irony when I found out I had a daughter with a severe allergy to the one thing I hated my entire life. We told my mother, and she laughed as well. She made jokes about how my baby must have heard me talking about my hatred for coconut oil while she was still cooking inside me and decided that she needed to hate it too. We all had a good laugh and left it at that. Or so I thought. My mother and I have always had a contentious relationship at best. We got along well enough, but we vehemently disagreed on certain topics. As far as raising my kids, my mother was hands-off and respected all of my decisions, even if she didn't like them sometimes. The only thing she continually got on my case about was the coconut oil thing. You see, my girls had very textured and curly hair. It was a little on the rough side, and my mother always insisted that a little bit of oil would make the curls soft and more defined. I always said no. I cannot understand how she did what happened next. I was giving a midterm that day to my students, and I had to be at my research lab late that night. My husband was away at some conference, and our nanny was down with the flu. So, I had my mom come take them for the day. My son was almost 3 years old, and the girls were a year and a half old. Overnight visits with my parents weren't exactly common. They weren't unusual either. They had always come back from these visits very happy and well taken care of, so I had no second thoughts about leaving them with my parents. They spoke to me on the phone after their lunch, and then, around 5 p.m., we video chatted. The kids were also happy and healthy. I got home around 10:30 p.m. that night and called my mom to see if the kids were up by any chance so I could say goodnight. I missed the kids by about 20 minutes. They'd already gone to bed. So, I talked to my mom for a little bit, but she's a pretty early sleeper too, so we hung up and went to bed. I woke up around 5 a.m. the next morning to go pick up my husband from the airport at 6. I picked up my husband, and neither one of us was very hungry yet, so we thought it'd be a nice treat to pick up the kids first and go to brunch with my parents. We got to my parents' house at 7:45 a.m. My parents weren't there. My son was at the neighbor's house and ran outside with the neighbor as soon as he saw his daddy and me pull up. He was hysterical and crying, and I couldn't calm him down. My blood pressure was rising because now I'm thinking that something horrible had happened to my parents. My neighbor tells me that she isn't sure what's happening, but there was an ambulance at my parents' house at 6 a.m. My dad had run over and woken them up to see if they could watch my son for a few hours until he got back. Of course, they'd said yes. I'm calling my parents nonstop at this point, and I'm getting frantic because I don't know what's happened. My son was still crying, but he was calmer. He still couldn't really explain to me what had happened, though. I honestly don't remember the details of what happened next, but somehow we figured out that the ambulance was from a hospital nearby. We broke several driving laws trying to get there. We got to the hospital, pulled into the emergency entrance that was for ambulances only, left the car, and bolted inside. A few nurses took notice of us immediately and were asking us what was wrong. I was calmer than my husband at this point, so I explained that I didn't know. I told her my twin girls and my parents were here somewhere. I'll never forget the look on that nurse's face. She knew exactly who I was at that moment, and she was about to cry. Another nurse took me and my husband to an empty room. They asked us to calm down and listen to the doctor before we went to find my family. My mother had put coconut oil in both my daughter's hair when they were playing the previous day before bed. The girls loved it when my mom did their hair, so they had asked for braids, and my mom accepted. She put coconut oil in both their hair because it would make for smoother braids. According to my son, Mary started to get a little dizzy and itchy when my mom was doing her hair. So my mom gave her some kids' Benadryl, which made her sleepy. Since it was close to bedtime anyways, the kids then went to bed. Giving her Benadryl was something we did whenever she had a mild reaction since it usually meant she accidentally came across some coconut from a secondary source. We also showered her from head to toe immediately to erase any lingering traces of it. My mother simply gave her some Benadryl, kept the coconut oil in her hair and put her to sleep. The Benadryl made her sleepy and unable to wake up or be conscious enough to wake up her brother or cry. She vomited in her sleep, and the rash spread all over. Her little body was swollen to twice the size. She had asphyxiated in her sleep. She died painfully and slowly in the early hours of the morning. My mother had found her when she went to check on the kids in the morning around 7 a.m. She was already dead by then. My mother screamed, called for my dad, and that's when they went to the hospital. My dad hadn't known about the coconut oil until my mom explained. To this day, I've never seen my father so angry. At the hospital, he was unable to look at my mother, out of fury, or me, out of shame. They had rushed to the hospital hoping there was some way to save Mary and to get Lisa checked out immediately since he thought she might have a mild allergy as well. I can't even explain to you the emotions my husband and I felt. I remember seeing my little girl and just being in denial. There was no way that she was gone. This had to be a horrible, horrible nightmare. The following days, the funeral, and explaining to my other kids what had happened are events I still can't talk about. It just breaks a part of me. My mother was investigated, as was my entire family. I almost lost my kids to my country's version of CPS once because they thought my kids were in danger. My husband and I had to fight tooth and nail to show that uprooting them during this time would be the worst thing for them. My mother was never arrested. My father did leave her, though they're not officially divorced. It's been 13 years. Brian just got his license this year, and Lisa is going to start high school soon. Both of them are healthy and turning into amazing adults. I don't think I could ever recover from the loss of my daughter. We miss her so much.
What is the most bone-chilling, inconceivable thing your parents have done to you? My parents never really wanted kids. I was an only child and pretty much an accidental pregnancy from what relatives have told me. My childhood was initially good, but after I started growing out of the cute and adorable phase, my parents were less inclined to spend time with me. They both worked and had their own business that they started together. That business was their life, and I always came second to it. Any other close family members lived states away, and I barely knew anything about them until I was an adult. So, I had no other family around my entire childhood. I was practically raised by TV and my school teachers. My own birthdays, by the time I became a teenager, were often spent without my parents as they just give me some money and tell me to go out and buy whatever I wanted. It was more or less the same with Christmas and sometimes even back to school shopping. After I turned 10, my parents no longer wanted to buy a tree at all. I had to convince my parents to buy a fake one that I could build up and then take apart later every year. When I turned 16, I asked my parents if I could work part-time for them at their business. They rejected me immediately and told me they didn't have any open spots. They may as well have just come right out and said they didn't want me there. After I turned 18, my parents told me that since I was an adult, they expected me to move out as soon as I was able. I was working part-time because I was still in high school and I didn't have anywhere near enough saved for college. Not long after high school ended, my parents told me to pack up and move out. They got an official eviction notice that gave me 30 days and everything. They didn't even help me move. I had to get help from a friend's dad who owns a truck. I ended up renting a cramped apartment and working retail. I had no real-life experience and no time for college. After just a few months, I got fired because my manager legitimately had it out for me and wrote me up for the stupidest things. I ended up going broke pretty fast because I was terrible at managing my own money and couldn't find steady employment. So I lost my apartment. I went back to my parents begging for help, but they refused to take me in. Not even for a little while to get back on my feet. I ended up homeless and living out of a tent in someone's backyard during the winter. My friends had all moved on to college, some in other states, and I was just a broke kid taking whatever work I could to stay alive. My salvation came when one of the neighbors of my parents found out I was living out of a tent and offered to take me in for a little while so I wouldn't freeze. She helped me badger my parents into telling me how to get in touch with the other members of my estranged family. My parents did not want to tell us at all. My guess is it was out of fear of being judged for throwing their son out the way they did. Eventually, they coughed up the info and gave me a list of contact details. Then they told me not to bother them ever again. Thankfully, I was able to call my grandparents from my father's side of the family. They were very surprised and happy to hear from me because they hadn't seen me since I was an infant. After learning about my situation, my grandparents flew me over to live with them as soon as they could. They basically adopted me. My parents didn't even see me off at the airport despite being invited to. I had zero contact with them for pretty much a decade. My grandparents said they despised my parents for treating me so poorly and legally disowned them by striking them from their wills. I'm told my parents were not happy to hear that. However, I figured it didn't really matter because they were plenty well off and didn't need anything from my grandparents. How wrong that statement turned out to be. After about a year of living with my grandparents, I was able to afford community college. I got an associate's degree, got a decent job, and eventually my grandparents offered to sell me their house so they could retire to Arizona. My grandma wanted to live in a warmer climate as the cold winter was getting harder and harder on her health every year. I was sad to see them go, but I happily bought the house. They sold it to me for 1/3 of its value and I'll have it paid off in a few more years. My position at the time forced me to go away on the road periodically. As a result, I can end up away from home for weeks at a time. One day, In late 2020, I came home after being away for over 2 weeks. Upon arrival, I found a large white van I did not recognize in my driveway. I was getting ready to call the police when I noticed the van had the logo for my parents' business on the side of it. All I felt was dread. My parents had broken in somehow and were living out of my home. On top of that, they had the nerve to greet me like we were buddy-buddy the moment I walked in. I told them to get the hell out, but they refused because it was Grandma and Grandpa's house. I said it wasn't their house anymore since they'd sold it to me when they retired. I told them they'd have known that if they were in any way involved in my life. But they threw me to the wolves 10 years prior with no life experience. We argued, and they refused to leave. My father told me it was his parents' house first and that meant he and my mother had the right to live there if they wanted. I walked right into my bedroom, locked the door, and called the police. When the cops showed up, they were of no help. My parents claimed to them that they had already been there long enough to have residency, which was a complete lie. Unfortunately, I had no cameras to prove they weren't there a month. My neighbors had no cameras either. As a result, it was my word against my parents over how long they'd really been there, and they were claiming squatters' rights. They told the police they had a verbal rental agreement with me, and that I was trying to illegally evict them for no reason. My mother even put on the waterworks when saying that. The police told me it was a family dispute, and to file eviction with the courts to get them out. Since this was in 2020, getting to court for anything took longer because of the pandemic. Meanwhile, my parents were squatting in my house rent-free and rubbing it in my face. From the information I got out of them, their business went bankrupt and they sold off almost everything they had to pay their debts. All they had left was the van and a few personal belongings. So they expected to live in my house rent-free for the foreseeable future. They were working too. Both of them soon got new jobs. My father is a delivery driver, my mother is a sales associate. They were making money and the only things they contributed to were electricity and water utilities. They basically just handed me a $100 bill every month and said I should be grateful they were paying me anything. Anytime I tried to discuss proper rent with them, they just said I owed it to them to live rent-free because I took 18 years of their lives. They then told me to be thankful that they weren't demanding the money back for that time. When I argued back, they threatened to stop helping with the utilities altogether. I was so at my wits' end that I ended up calling my grandparents to explain the situation to them. They were very unhappy and spoke with my parents, but they still said they had the right to stay in my home. They refused to budge. My grandpa told me he was sorry it had come to this and that if they hadn't sold me the house, my parents wouldn't have invaded. I told him not to worry. I'd already filed for a legal eviction and would get it soon enough. I told him my parents already knew that they were on borrowed time. I made sure to say that in earshot of them too. They responded with a silent treatment. My father was away most of the time driving a delivery vehicle 6 days a week, which was a job really not to his liking. My mother basically tried to take over my house in her spare time. She demanded I let her rearrange my living room. At one point, she even tried to force me to give her and my father the master bedroom. She argued that they were my parents, and they deserve better. I vetoed both of those things and said they don't deserve better, and to stop trying to act like I owe them anything. I didn't ask to be born, and it's a normal obligation for parents to raise their own children. I told her I knew they were trying to assert dominance to try and keep me from kicking them out. I let her know her time was coming soon enough. Finally, after 4 months and now into early 2021, I managed to take my parents to court over their squatting. We only needed to go to court because they fought the eviction and tried to gaslight me into rescinding it. They tried to use the fact that it was formerly my grandparents' house and attempted to use the $100 monthly payments as some sort of leverage. However, there was no real rental agreement, and they were smart enough not to forge one as that would have been fraud. In the end, the judge ordered that they needed to be out on a maximum of 30 days because they have zero claim on my house. After court, they confronted me and said they were disappointed in me for kicking out my own flesh and blood. I couldn't help but laugh. I call them hypocrites because that's exactly what they did to me without a care in the world for my well-being. They had no love for me, so I have no love for them. I owed them nothing. They just tried to act like everything that was mine was theirs, but they had no right to call themselves my parents because they'd never really acted like it. I called them a pair of snobby, lying, and now broke narcissists to their faces, then told them to get their affairs in order. They knew I wouldn't hesitate to call the police if they didn't leave my house when the 30 days were over. My father looked enraged, but my mother stopped him from saying or doing anything by grabbing his shoulder and shaking her head. He sneered at me and walked away. I just laughed in his face. They eventually left, but not without a lot of difficulty. That final month was spent with them either guilting me to try and make me change my mind or completely ignoring me. I put up a calendar in the living room and checked off each day before they had to leave with a red marker. The exact day they were to be out was marked with a big red circle. I still remember that final day was March 2nd. My parents waited until the exact day they had to leave my home for good before they finally left. What's even funnier is that they had been so convinced they could make me let them stay that they didn't bother to look for an apartment until after the court eviction went through. My mother spent weeks scrambling to find an apartment. They had to get a tiny and cramped studio apartment in the next city over because it was the only thing they could find on such short notice. It was a lot like what I had to do when I was 18. Quite ironic. I drove my mother over to see it once, and the apartment was terrible. The walls were baby barf green, and the carpet looked like it was 20 years old. The only window just had a view of a brick wall outside, and there was no dishwasher. The stove was the smallest one I'd ever seen, the toilet looked like it needed to be replaced, and the walls also did little to stop noise from neighbors. There were already 2 people loudly fighting in the adjacent apartment while we were there. My mother went out of her way to give me sad eyes the whole time. She tried dropping hints that I should be feeling guilty for reducing them to live in such a place. I just acted oblivious to it all until she finally stopped. They signed the lease right away and moved what little stuff they had into the apartment over the weekend. They also ended up demanding the queen-size bed, dresser, and flat-screen TV for my guest room. I told them to just take the damn things because I no longer wanted them in the house after they spent 5 months sleeping in that room. They looked at me like I was treating them as though they were diseased and demanded nothing more. The moment they had to leave for good, I started changing the locks on all exterior doors. All their stuff was at the apartment, and they'd spent their last night in my guest room. When the move was finally over, they watched me start ripping the old lock off the front door as they were getting into the van. They said nothing, I said nothing. They just sat and watched me for a while until I had the new doorknob on. Then they finally left. I breathed a massive sigh of relief the second that van went down the road. I figured karma had finally come for them, and they could live under a rock for all I cared. But nope, my grandparents heard from them recently. They'd call them to brag about having a new business similar to their old one in the same state I'm living in now. Unfortunately, they are basically on track to being right back to where they used to be in life prior to the pandemic. I've already Googled their new business, and it seems like it's doing well. They have many positive reviews and everything. I'm pretty freaking resentful, truth be told. They put me through being homeless, squatted pretty much for free at my house for months, then went right back to being the snobby wine-drinking business people they used to be. If karma is real, it's taking too damn long. What is the most bone-chilling, inconceivable thing your parents have done to you? My mom kicked me out 2 years ago in favor of her boyfriend who bullied me in high school. My dad passed away when I was only 1. It's been me and my mom ever since. As you can guess, my mom and I were very close. When I was a sophomore in high school, my mom got a part-time job as a gym teacher at my school. I supported her when she asked if I would be comfortable with it. It was extremely uncomfortable when guys would make comments on my mom's appearance. It also gave ammo to Brad who bullied me in high school. He would make inappropriate comments about her towards me. So I thought I was finally rid of him after he graduated. I was wrong. When I became a senior, my mom started going out very often. Initially, I was happy for her because I wanted her to find someone nice. However, it came to a point where we barely got any time together. To be frank, I thought she was avoiding me. This was because whenever I tried to make plans with her, she had already made plans before. I sort of kept it to myself because I didn't want to come off needy. I didn't complain when she missed my birthday because she was out all night. When she tried to apologize the next day, I told her it was okay. After 6 months of this behavior, I decided to take action. I asked my mom if we could have dinner together, just the 2 of us. She said she was too busy. I got fed up and told her to stop ignoring me. She said that she wasn't ignoring me, but that she had a life to live. That really hurt me a lot. Out of anger, I started to ignore her for a few days. After those days passed, she finally apologized to me. However, she said she needed to talk to me about something important. She wanted to introduce me to her boyfriend at dinner. She didn't sound excited about it. It sounds like she almost dreaded it. When the door rang, my mom opened it up and introduced the guy to me. I was in extreme shock. It was Brad. I screamed at my mom, asking her what he was doing here. Brad came forward to acknowledge that this situation was uncomfortable, but he's sorry for how he treated me in school and that he really cares about my mom. My mom asked us to sit and let her explain how this all happened. I remember screaming, "I don't give a damn about your explanation. You tossed me aside for this piece of crap. You're a pathetic excuse of a mother." My mom then defended him and said, "Don't you dare call him that." She then said she tried to accommodate everyone in this tough situation by keeping the relationship away from me. She then said, "Like it or not, Brad is here to stay. If you don't like it, you're more than welcome to leave." I packed my bags right there and then. I called my grandma and told her about the whole situation. She drove to my house and confronted my mom. After a shouting match between them, I left with my grandma. My mom tried calling me several weeks after, but I blocked her. She tried to visit me, but I called the cops on her. After that, she sort of gave up. It had been 2 years since I'd heard from my mom. Then I got a call from her yesterday. She said it's urgent and we needed to meet up. I didn't know if I should go, but curiosity got the best of me. There was also a burning desire to unload on her. I finally texted back my mom this morning asking where we should meet. She said we could meet for lunch at the restaurant at 12 p.m. I didn't have any class today, so I was good to go. When I arrived at the restaurant, I heard some woman scream my name. It was my mom, who I haven't seen for 2 years. She asked how I was and said she would hug me, but she knew I would reject it. Her voice was shaking when she asked me to follow her to her table. Unsurprisingly, Brad was sitting there. He didn't even look me in the eye as we sat down. He just nodded his head as if to simply acknowledge my arrival. As my mom sat down, she started shooting out multiple questions. What you've been up to? Are you in school? How's it going? I got annoyed and told her, stop wasting my time with these questions. What do you want from me? She responded, well, before we tell you, can we explain how all of this happened? I said sure. She explained that they never interacted with each other when Brad was in school. Brad only knew about her because his friends would take pictures of her before gym class started and share them with everyone. It was Brad who approached her at a bar. She didn't recognize him. So he told her he went to the high school she works at and graduated recently. My mom was lonely and jokingly told him she wouldn't tell anyone that he wasn't 21 as long as he hung out with her. They exchanged numbers and made a promise to hang out with each other. She said she knew that I wouldn't be comfortable with her seeing a peer of mine. So she kept it a secret and convinced herself it was going to be a short and casual relationship. Eventually, the relationship got serious. When she was hanging out at his house, she asked him about introducing him to me. He told her it wasn't a good idea. She responded by saying I'd get over the age gap relationship. He was forced to come clean about the relationship I had with him in high school. That's when my mom started tearing up and her voice was shaking. She said she was in shock about what she had done. She couldn't sleep at night because of the guilt. She couldn't even look at me without feeling immense guilt. She had him blocked on her phone. After a week he sent her a message on Facebook to at least meet him once. She obliged. He showed up with roses and begged for forgiveness. He even said he'll apologize to me in person and that he's a changed person. She took him back. The next was the day she invited him to dinner. My mom burst into tears and begged me to forgive her for hurting me. She then said these 2 years have been painful for her. Finally, Brad spoke and admitted, she misses you like crazy, dude. She still needs you in her life. My mom then said, I am sorry for being an awful mother. We want to make it up to you. We're moving to California and we want you to come with us. We will foot the bill for your education and everything else. You won't have to work at all. You'll have a permanent place in our home. I don't know what the hell came to me, but I started laughing like crazy, like a madman. It was the most ridiculous proposition. Now, this part is what makes me the monster. This is what I really came there for. After I calmed down, this is what I said to her. Mom, you must be a delusional piece of crap if you think I'll ever forgive you. You are dead to me for good. The only acknowledgement you'll get from me is me pissing on your grave when you pass away. Then she was hysterically crying. I got up from the table and left the restaurant. Only a minute after walking to the parking lot, I hear my mom screaming at Brad to stop following me. I really wanted this confrontation. The moment he grabbed my shirt, I turned around and sucker punched him in the face. He dropped on the road with his mouth bleeding. My mom came to physically restrain him from hurting me until he calmed down. I told them, this is what I think about your proposal. It's been 4 hours now since the incident. I know deep down I should be ashamed of myself. But I feel amazing inside. I don't know if adrenaline can last that long. It feels like I took my power back.